Okay, welcome everybody. Sorry for the slight delay. We're experiencing some technical difficulty. You can probably figure out what our workaround was. We have both Van Davis and Rob Curtin here to talk to us about privacy in EdTech. I'm going to kick it off very, very simply by asking them to begin by introducing themselves. So Van, in 1 or 2 minutes, why don't you share with the group your background and your expertise, bearing in mind that this will help them determine who they're going to ask questions to at the end.
Sure. My name is Van Davis. I'm the Associate Vice President for Higher Education Policy and Research at Blackboard. And I've been with Blackboard for not quite a year and a half. My background is very solidly from the academic side. Before joining Blackboard, I spent 7.5 years at the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board, which is the state higher education regulatory agency in Texas, where I was the Director of Innovation in Higher Ed. But before that, I spent a decade as a faculty member and an academic administrator. My background is as a historian, specifically a civil rights historian and a 20th century U.S. historian who cut my teeth in the Johnson Presidential Archives. So I've always been a bit of a policy wonk.
Cool. And Van is joining us from Austin, by the way.
Yes.
Rob, your turn. Please introduce yourself. And again, sorry, the video seems to be a little challenging for us this time.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here and appreciate your patience. It turns out that I work in the dark, and you couldn't see my face, but Microsoft's working under sustainability clauses here in Redmond, and we don't like to waste a lot of light when the monitors reflect. So my name is Rob Curtin. I have been in the EdTech space really since 1989. When, as a Northeastern University co-op, I worked for IBM and set up Boston Public Schools' first classroom networks. Came to work for Microsoft in 1991, which is a really long time ago. And to put it in perspective, Excel did not have an auto sum button at that time. So most of you think Excel has always had an auto sum button, but there was a day when it was just columns and rows. So I've been with 2 startups, and that's really, I think, beyond my role at Microsoft is the most prevalent experience. One, I had the opportunity to work in the student information system space for about 10 years, and that's where I got to know, I think, one of your cohort members, Dave Becker. We were both at a company called SCT together. He's much smarter than I am, but I would argue I was more handsome. So the other element was the past 2 years, I actually was in the Learn Launch cohort, going through exactly what you're going through, working for a company called PIP Learning Technologies, where we had a service called the Trust Platform. We focused on student privacy and helping schools solve the student privacy problem by using identity standards. Because the foundation of most privacy conversations is, well, who am I talking to? And the rules change dramatically when you can answer that question. Because a parent, it's pretty simple. The answer is yes. A student, yes. Teacher, yes. Anyone else? No. So having identity standards and following privacy best practices is something that really doesn't exist in K through 12. There are some models in higher ed that you can follow. So it's that experience plus my exposure at Microsoft that I'm going to speak to you from today.
Awesome. Let's jump right in here. So why don't, since Rob, you were talking, why don't you keep talking? I'll direct this one to you.
Sure.
First. Why don't you just, the background on FERPA. Privacy is more than FERPA, but let's start with FERPA. In a nutshell, what is it and why was it created?
Sure. So FERPA, I'm sure you all know, is the Family Education Rights and Privacy Act, federal government law that is focused on institutions. And that's probably one of the most important elements of FERPA, in that the core thing about FERPA, I mean, if you put it this way, is we don't ever want to embarrass a presidential candidate. Because if their grades were ever let out that they couldn't pass basic economics while they were in college, what would we do? So all academic records are sealed, employers can't look them up, and that's really an important part of individual privacy. That the most that you can say is, yes, he or she attended here, and any additional information beyond that, or what's called basic directory information, is there to give the individual the power to make sure that people who they don't want to see their health records, their academic records, HIPAA applies to health, but FERPA is that academic equivalent. That is a deep obligation on institutions to protect the private information of their students.
Cool. So Van, let me direct it to you, and Rob, you'll also jump in on this one too. In your experience, Van, what are some of the misconceptions about FERPA?
Well, I think as Rob just pointed out, FERPA deals with institutions, and I think that that's one of the misconceptions, is that third-party vendors oftentimes believe that FERPA is directly applicable to them, and that's not the case. Now, COPA is directly applicable to them, and we can talk about that later. But that doesn't, I think once you know that FERPA deals with institutions, that doesn't take you off the hook. Because one of the things that's, I think, really important to understand about many of our higher ed institutions in the US is that they are hit from all sides with an overabundance of regulations. We thought that there would be some decrease in those last year if the Higher Education Act was reauthorized, and it wasn't. So I think that what we have are institutions that are very hyper aware of the regulatory environment in which they work, even though we're not aware of any institutions that have been fined on FERPA. If they were, it's very high stakes for them, because basically what it means is that they lose their Department of Education funding. And most of the financial aid that an institution's students receive is federal financial aid from Title IV. So that's an enormous stake that's in the game. So I think that that's probably the biggest misconception about FERPA, is that it applies to companies when really it's applicable to institutions.
So just, I'm going to recap it, and you'll correct me if I get it wrong. It doesn't really apply to the startups, except that it kind of does, because the penalties for a violation on the university side are so, I mean, they're the nuclear bomb, basically.
Yes.
So they'll make sure that you don't bring them into violation.
Yes. And actually, to further complicate it, and we can talk about this later, there is a revision of FERPA that's pending in Congress right now that would actually begin to apply directly to startups and other vendors.
Okay, cool. Sorry about that. I think I may have cut out a bit. Can you confirm that I'm back on the air, Doug?
You're good. I can hear you.
Okay, sorry. I saw a note that I cut out. So Rob, in your experience, any other common misconceptions with FERPA?
No, I think Van really nailed it by saying there's a number of service providers that claim to be FERPA compliant, when in reality there is no such thing. It's that an institution is going to demand that you be FERPA compliant. So exactly. That actually is worse than having federal standards, because now you're subject to the individual interpretation of every state and individual institution's attorneys.
So that's actually a great transition. That's what I was going to ask you next. So from a practical perspective, what does that mean that startups generally have to do? And I was going to ask you if there's a range of stuff. So why don't we keep running with that? Like, what are the most common things that a university would ask a vendor to do at a bare minimum to make sure that they're okay? And then we'll layer on top of that the other stuff they ask if they're more and more conservative.
Yeah, so if I'm a startup, right, I need to look at this a couple of ways. One is first, what is your user adoption model, and ultimately what do you think your business model is going to be? The vast majority of startups, not all of them, the vast majority of startups today are really focused on user trial and viral adoption, and they tend to take who cares about FERPA, right? It's not my fault, and they embed into the click wrap what effectively is a false assertion by the end user that they are making you a school official for the purpose of getting any data in. But what ultimately happens is you look for some type of a revenue model, and then you come to the institution and you say, great, did you know you have 50 users who are super happy with my service? How would you like to pay for it? And then you run into people in what I call wingtips and Birkenstocks. And the wingtip folks want to have a very serious legal conversation with you, and the Birkenstocks folks want to have a new technical conversation with you. And your model around consumer, fill out a form, generate my old ID, now gets totally broken because the manner in which you do authentication and sign-on no longer kind of works, and the terms of service no longer apply. And that's when the institution is going to come to you and say, okay, these are the things that you have to stand up to. And the most important is that you're agreeing to be a school official. You are an agent of the school doing a job that they would otherwise do, and are therefore accepting the standards that they apply to everyone else, right? So, or that they apply to themselves, which ultimately means you are under their control and all of the data belongs to them. So that has a long list of things, but most of them are data breach disclosures, indemnification, handling costs in case you're hacked, to then inform every single one of their alumni, constituents, students, and staff. And that represents massive business risk to you.
So hang on, Rob. I just want to recap something, and then I want to jump into what you just started talking about. For the teams on the call, one of the practical examples is you have a company that's decided that their model is, say, they go to the teachers first. It's a free model, and then when you get enough teachers in the school, you try to upsell it to the university. So what happens is the teacher signs a term of service, and they make you, an agent of the school. But what the hell do they know, right? And no one sues the teacher, so it doesn't really matter.
You got it.
But then you try to sell it to the university or the school, and they're like, whoa, that doesn't fly for us. And now you've not only coded an entire site, but you also built a business model around something. You need to rip it all up to now comply with a totally different level of standards. Rob, jump in there if I put words in your mouth, but I think that's an example of what we were talking about.
No, you made it coherent. Thank you.
Yeah. So let's keep running with that. So Rob, you started listing a couple of things that typically come up in these situations. So let's break them down kind of piece by piece and talk about it. So, what's the first thing or the biggest thing that they need to do and how they store and handle the data for the school?
The first thing that they're going to demand is that there's no secondary business purpose or any use of the data for anything other than the explicit service that you're providing to them.
So concretely, what kind of stuff would they be on the lookout for?
Concretely, they're going to be on the lookout for you mining or using any of that information for any purpose outside of the explicit purpose for which you've been contracted. And for a number of companies, there's sort of this, but we get data. We sign up a bunch of schools, and then we'll have a bunch of data and we can sell that. And so there are good models around statistics or in selling the school a view of the data back to them since they own it. But if you touch on any type of advertising or direct sale of the data or remarketing of the data, that's just a no-brainer. You can't do it. There's not much insight from me there. The second is going to be around your standards for security, where your data centers, how secure are they? And then ultimately, it's the next two things get difficult, and that's data breach indemnification, where you're agreeing to pay all the costs, which could immediately put you out of business, or notifying all of their people that there was a data breach and paying credit reporting, et cetera. And then the last is assurance of data deletion, because you are agreeing to be under their control. And if that ends upon termination of your agreement, there's typically a clawback that says we can tell you to delete all of our records. And depending on your interpretation, that is extended to metadata as well. And most good design today has a never delete best practice, right? We never delete, we mark as inactive. But the laws of FERPA actually say if I ask you to delete, you're going to need to code in delete. So, don't use it for marketing. Maintain high security standards that meet our standards, and then you then have to indemnify us legally, and you've got to delete records on my demand and make sure they're forever gone from your infrastructure.
So Van, you were nodding a lot there. Anything to add, or that's kind of the four big categories?
I think those are the four big categories. I would just add, on the off chance that you are dealing with data from students who are under the age of 13, then that marketing piece adds an extra layer of complexity and danger and risk for you, because that's when COPA would come into play. And the FTC has not been shy about levying fines on companies and sites that they believe are inappropriately using the data that they have collected from minors for marketing purposes.
Let's run with that a little bit. So number one for these, I think most of my guys know this, but that's the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, not to be confused with COPPA with one P, which I think is dead. I think that's dead. So Van, why don't you just take a moment here and explain the principles behind it. What age group does that kick in at? What do you need to do between the parents and the students, and what's the fine? What's the damage if you get caught?
So, passed in 1998, and I think that there's a similar problem here as there is with FERPA. I mean, we're dealing with privacy legislation that was passed when really folks were putting paper records into a filing cabinet and sticking them in a locked back room. And that doesn't fly, unfortunately, anymore. With this particular piece, though, the benchmark is for children who are under the age of 13. There are some very specific guidelines about needing to have verifiable parental approval for a child to share information. And then the FTC has also placed some very, very specific guidelines around the types of information that there has to be approval over. And it goes much deeper than just the sort of directory level information that we see with FERPA. In this case, there are specific concerns about geolocation information. If a company is collecting that, especially if an app is collecting that. There are also very specific concerns about visual representations of the child, photos, movies, and even audio representations, recordings of voices. So, the rule of thumb here, I think, and I say this as somebody who is a policy wonk and not a lawyer, but the rule of thumb here is to assume that probably some of your greatest risk is going to be, at least in terms of direct fines and direct violations, is going to lie with this legislation. And the FTC has a history of levying fines. This one is administered by the FTC. They fined Zynga a few years ago, $1 million. The sort of standard is $16,000 per child per violation. So that can add up very quickly, especially if you're a smaller startup. And again, it deals with not just websites, but it deals with apps. And there's a lot of concern here about that remarketing of information, or even using direct advertising based upon the data that you have collected. And so even a site that is collecting data for something else, but has some sort of direct advertising streams into it based upon this information, is going to find itself at risk. And so that creates a few more wrinkles there, I think, especially in terms of how startups are maybe funding, and especially sites are maybe funding some of these things.
So a couple of points I'll add, and I'm going to cue this up as, if you want to learn more about that, come to me or I'll hook you up with Van. Number one, chat rooms or anything live are particularly painful. Number two, you can sometimes, depending on what services you are, if you're not aimed at children under 13, you can basically say, check here to say that you're not under 13 and you're good to go, but that does not fly if you're dealing with an elementary school-based product, because clearly they are going to be part of the people you're talking to. So, that's an out that doesn't really exist for most of the K-8s focused startups here. But let's, I have a question here from Melissa. She's curious how student LinkedIn is getting around selling student information to both universities and advertisers. And that's actually a great question, because the next thing I was going to ask was, what are some models around EdTech or EdTech services where things like FERPA do not come into play? And that's probably a good example of that. Van, do you want to keep the screen, or do you want to turn it over to Rob?
I'm going to happily turn it over to Rob on this one.
Yeah, so this all starts with, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not giving you lawyerly advice. I'm sharing observations. But one of the nice things is that if you're dealing with consumers, right? And so this is, if your business model is to purely deal with consumers, and those consumers are adults, and you can prove that they're adults, then you really don't have to worry about any of this. And that's really, you know, yeah, you can't do bad things like sell it to the Russians and stuff like that. But what you can do with Student LinkedIn is you're saying, look, these are college students who are adults who are accepting a consumer terms of service as an adult. And I think, you know, there's some fairly obvious ones where, say, University Beyond within your cohort is saying, look, we're trying to disintermediate the career services office, which it's inefficient for companies. It's not that good for students. And, you know, built by students for students, let's connect you directly as adults with employers and effectively create kind of a private monster.com or indeed.com for the career services office. Adults sign up, you go to the back end, you know, you're basically trying to give the finger to the institution. So who cares? Where it gets sort of interesting is the ChemPro folks who are in the store. So you get downloaded from a store, which is by definition a consumer spot. But then payment may actually come from codes that are delivered through the institution. So are students being required by an institution to use a consumer service? That falls into the gray area of you all must drink Pepsi, which obviously people would say, wow, the school can't make me drink Pepsi, but they can say, I can make you use this service that has a consumer agreement. And then that puts the institution actually at risk. So that gets gray. And then you have Campus 8 ESP with Dave, and he's got this awesome sort of model where students are coming in and being paid by the institution to service that student information and provide a service to the institution. But he's gathering adults as parents who are choosing to download a consumer app. So he can bifurcate his terms of service, for which the data that he's providing to institutions is absolutely held and secured under FERPA. But the parents are choosing to use an application and accepting in terms of service as adults and consumers, for which he can drive as many ads as Candy Crush through it if he wants. And that's kind of interesting. And so how you define whether you're consumer and adults and who pays, the last kind of interesting trick is not really a trick, it's what Cengage does. Cengage says the institution will buy your drink from you, but you're agreeing to use the drink. So you as a student buy a card with a code that you get through the bookstore. The institution uses a service, but then you consume the curriculum and agree to the terms of service as an adult using that curriculum.
So it seems like the common theme here is if the startup is engaging directly with an adult consumer, even if they're providing EdTech, but so long as the university isn't providing the startup with information, those models could, at least in theory, not come under FERPA at all.
I think where it gets interesting is whenever we start moving into the curriculum space. And for example, when I was at the coordinating board, I negotiated a contract with a major EdTech provider between that provider and two of our institutions for a competency-based education program. And we had an enormous amount of conversation around the privacy clauses in that contract, because even though the students were consuming curriculum, and there was a contractual agreement between the student and the content provider, it was still taking place within the construct of the student's the institution's learning management system, which meant that there was institutional data that that third-party provider had access to. And so I think when we start talking about this issue of curriculum especially, even if it is this model of the student buys the code from the bookstore, if it's going to come through that institution's learning management system or any of that infrastructure, then that's going to create an institutional obligation around that.
Got it. Let me ask, I got Melissa up here. Melissa, I want to check with you. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, I'm Melissa Shipke. I'm a CEO of Tassel. My team's all on this video conference now too. We're just chatting because our product essentially allows alumni to self-report information around engagement into our platform, but universities to also report into that platform as well. So, we're always playing around with the way our contracts are set up is the data is completely owned by the university. And only can be sold within that university. But, we have questions all the time around what are the other things that we'll be able to do with some of that data. So that was where, what LinkedIn's doing became of interest because it seems like they're working their way around selling not only to the universities, but selling elsewhere as well.
Well, I think as Van said, I see what you're doing with Tassel, and it's sort of great, right? It's helping universities engage with alumni in a manner that's much more familiar and relevant for today's engagement terms, right? Like, I had a web page that I never go to hanging off your website is no longer as important as mining social networks and being where I already am. Where it gets a little interesting is that at some point, the institution is providing you with that alumni data, right? And you're connecting to it. So your service is clearly to the institution. And if the data that you gather is something that you allow them to pay for, the presentation, the analytics, the aggregation, right? That you're giving them insight back that they couldn't otherwise get, you're providing a service to them, and that's perfectly fine. Where it would get sticky is if you're saying in 3 years we're going to have, and I mean sticky like difficult, not sticky like persistent. In 3 years we're going to have 3 million students registered in our platform. Then I would suggest that you would need some type of a bridge app for which an individual says, I'd like to do something else, and now that I'm a graduate who has the following engagement with my institution, I, as an individual, am now agreeing that I'm going to take on another relationship with Tassel that allows me to tap into a network beyond my institution, for instance. And I'm just ideating with you on what you might do. But if you can get that adult to accept the different terms of service to enter a different part of your area, which cross-institution networking could be very exciting. Then you're covered because an adult accepted that terms of service. But there has to be a clear crosswalk. There has to be clear identification to that adult, what you plan to do with the data, et cetera.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay, great. Ethan actually had a related question, also about to the extent that he integrates with a university system and then ultimately delivers certain content via app. So let's bring Ethan forward and let him ask that question now.
Yeah, can you guys hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great. So yeah, my question really was along the FERPA and data policy. When we integrate with like Blackboard or Canvas, we have access to like student assignments and information. If we want access to student grades, which are obviously on the LMS, is there a way we could say, well, if we get this product is only accessible if students consent in the app, as in we show them terms of service and they have to like waive all their rights, I guess you could say, or they give us the right to access those grades. Would that be a path to being FERPA compliant?
Now, before anyone answers this, they're not lawyers. So the right answer is ask your lawyer. They're just going to give you their opinion as to where that probably fits out on the spectrum.
I think Van, as the LMS guy, is probably best.
As Doug puts him right under the bus. Okay. Unless, Rob, you're raising your hand. It doesn't matter. Who wants to take a stab at it?
No, I mean, I am not a lawyer despite what my mother wanted, despite the fact that my mother wanted me to become a lawyer. I would say that that's a very gray area. You probably, I think that that would probably be a workaround. I mean, again, you're getting permission from the student directly. They're over the age of 18, but I do think that that would raise some angst for the institution. Remembering the sort of angst that I had when I was at an institution. The other piece of this is, I think that it might raise the angst of that LMS provider or that other third-party vendor. So, because one of the things that I think we're very aware of whenever we're developing a learning management system or any other company is that is such a direct, important relationship with the institution, that we are hyper vigilant and hyper aware of those institutional concerns around privacy and other things. And we're going to be, I think any LMS would be this way, is going to want to be especially careful in terms of how access is being granted to data on that system to other bodies. I'm not saying it's impossible, but I think that you should anticipate that there will be some wingtip conversations around that.
Rob, anything to add?
I'm going to be a little more firm. I think Van was fairly articulate and nice. That's a deceitful pivot that I think you're trying to make, and that the FERPA compliance perspective of the institution would say that, at no point am I going to actually bring a service in that is trying to do you can connect to the LMS and you can see grades and you can present that to a student as part of some supplemental app that the institution deems advances the educational interests of both the student and the institution. But the institution does not want to give up control of grades. The institution would not sign an agreement with a company because their own FERPA clause would say, you're not going to use this for any marketing purpose. And if the first thing you do is say, hey, student, click this button to separate yourself from the institution. The tassel conversation was architecturally similar, and my guidance to them, the difference was about the student who has now left an institution, is a graduate, is no longer really associated, and they're choosing to join a different network, and they're not taking their grades with them. There has been some work with the U.S. government around a My Data button that would sort of fall into the late night TV ad. It's my data and I want it now. So there's some movement there, but those standards really don't exist, or they haven't been adopted in any great way. So I think both the institution and the LMS provider are reluctant to relinquish control of grade level data. There's public data that places like MyEDU on and crawled, like course catalog and course section offerings. And then they've used FOIA to sort of bring back aggregate completion rates. But if you're asking for individual LMS data, I think that's a stretch.
And I would just add that even if there are some schools that would get comfortable with it, I would imagine there's a sizable minority, if not a majority of them, for whom that would probably either kill the sale or seriously impede it. Okay, let's keep going. By the way, in case it wasn't obvious, please, if you have questions, you can post it to the chat room at any time, and we'll leave a little time at the end as well. But I want to ask a few more questions just to make sure we've covered all the ground that we can possibly cover in this time. So we've talked a lot about FERPA, we've talked a lot about COPA. What other federal or notable state regulations should be on the startup's radar in the privacy arena?
Well, there's a lot of state regulations. I think the fact that we have seen such inactivity on the federal level recently to pass revisions of FERPA and COPA has meant that there has been an enormous amount of state activity. Just yesterday, Colorado passed a Student Data Privacy Act. In 2014, we had the California legislation, and quite frankly, that piece of legislation has ended up being especially instrumental since many of the state many of the other state pieces of legislation that came up last year in 2015 were at least somehow based upon what California passed in 2014. So I think the bad news here for a company is that there are so many pieces of state legislation that you are going to have to deal with this on a state-by-state level, and that is because there has not been federal reform happen. So this has devolved back to the states.
So to the extent that we can generalize on California and on Colorado, what issues are they raising that impact the startup? What other issues do the startups need to be thinking about?
But I'm interested to hear Rob's take on this. I think for me, the biggest issue in this legislation is that whereas FERPA deals with the institution, a lot of these newer state laws deal specifically with the third-party vendors. And so the crux of the requirements in terms of being in compliance is directed towards the startup and the third-party vendor and not the institution. And that places them at greater risk than for fines.
Got it. So Rob, chime in here, please.
I'm going to say two potentially conflicting things, right?
Sure, why not?
The first is around, yeah, this is serious. And the second is, yeah, but there's a giant loophole. So it's really one of public opinion. Van hinted out earlier that no one wants, this is my sort of cheesy phrase, no one's going to perp walk a teacher, right? Teachers sign up and commit crimes every day. And I say crimes because they are really civil violations of FERPA. By signing up for some great tool, telling all the students to do it, they assert that they're an agent of the school when they're not. And so there's places like Class Dojo that, while they've never been sued, Class Dojo has committed more crime, I shouldn't say crimes, has committed more acts that In Bloom was accused of committing that they never actually did. Clever is ingesting rosters at no fee. So there's a lot of stuff out there, but if generally people think you're good, then that's okay. And no one's going to perp walk a teacher is kind of my answer. So the state legislation says, well, let's put the punitive activity over to the companies. And so now, if you knowingly do something where a nice third grade teacher signs all of her students up for a cool fill in the blank class, and here's where someone like a Chempro, right, where you have this issue. But the giant loophole is that all of these, which is based on the SOPIPA Act in California, and others have kind of followed suit, are fundamentally theater and political statements that rarely kind of trump individual rights, et cetera. But you run a huge risk. The giant loophole is you can simply say, I'm not for institutions. I'm not for the classroom. The Wall Street Journal is used in classrooms across the country. People use Bing and YouTube in classrooms across the country. And none of those services, Google Hangouts explicitly say, we are not covered under the Google Apps for Education license. Google Hangouts and YouTube itself are consumer services. It's not our problem if schools try to bring them in. They're committing the crime, not us. So if you go ahead and define a service for individuals, say a cohort of teachers to share best practices, that's for individuals in their professional lives to share best practices outside the institution. We have supplemental learning like Khan Academy. So there's a bunch of precedent out there where tools are used in schools really at the peril of the schools, and you're simply saying, I'm a consumer service, doesn't apply to me, and so you can do whatever you want. So I'm not telling you to go off and flout state rule, but I would ask you to have a deep conversation with your lawyer to say, how am I different than the Wall Street Journal? Because people find an education and classroom purpose, as long as I don't define myself as marketing to a classroom, there's a giant loophole to go through.
So we're not going to quote Rob on either teachers are creating are perpetrating crimes every day, and we're not going to quote you on the hey, you can get around it because just say you're not an educational service. But the takeaway for you guys, the startups, is if you think these apply to you, that's one of the conversations you want to have with your lawyer to see if that's the case. And, you know, it might be the right way to structure your business.
I would
Public opinion, like that's the harsh part.
Yes. I was just about to say, I would add in, though, I think you have to be very aware of what public opinion is right now, especially around data breaches, and especially in those states where there have been some very large breaches. You know, I think that, for example, in Texas, where we had the comptroller's office actually had a breach of state employee data, I would not want to have been a startup talking about collecting student data immediately after that, because I'm not sure that the court of public opinion would have been very willing to entertain that. So I think that there's this other, there's the legal issues, and then there's what's smart in terms of how the public is going to perceive you.
That's a great point. I was actually going to transition to that next. The regulations are only part of the picture. In many cases, the university itself will have its own common sense requirements about what they want you to do or not do that may be above and beyond FERPA and COPA and SIPA. I don't even know what the California one is.
SOPIPA, S-O-P-I-P-A.
SOPIPA. Oh my God, where do they come up with this? And then there also might be third-party certifications or compliances that, you know, have come up through the free market as a whole. And actually, that's what I wanted to ask you guys about. You know, I've heard about LTI as one of these certifications. Can you speak to any meaningful, you know, third-party standards, you know, voluntary, or sometimes they're a condition of accessing, say, an LMS, that the startups should at least have on their radar?
Ben, you want to go first?
Yeah, it's not a certification per se, but I think that we're seeing an interesting movement with the Student Privacy Pledge, which is, you know, completely voluntary. There's almost 250 EdTech companies that have taken it, and it runs the gambit from Apple to Blackboard, Canvas, Microsoft, ClassDojo, interestingly enough, and sort of everything in between. I call that out because even though it is purely voluntary and there is really no regulation around it, those standards in that Student Privacy Act or Student Privacy Pledge are the same standards that we've started to see show up in proposed legislation in Congress. And so I do think that it gives us a lens into what we might anticipate seeing, assuming Congress ever passes anything. And I'll go on record saying that there's no way that this is going to get past this session. We're a third of the way through the legislative days on the House, which only had 100 to start with. So this will probably be forthcoming in 2017. But I would start there.
Could you run down just a couple of the elements of the Student Privacy Pledge where they differ from, you know, what we've talked about before?
You know, I don't think that there's really any significant differences there. A lot of it, though, is going to go back to, probably the biggest difference goes back to this idea of being responsive to an institution and to parents in terms of deleting data. And I think that that is a big piece of it, is this idea of deleting data when asked and requirements around that. So that's probably the biggest difference that we're looking at.
You mean unlike some social networks who shall not be named, but they rhyme with Facebook? Rob, anything you want to add on the subject?
Yeah, well, I think there's a couple of resources, right? Again, as we get, I don't know if I'm hopping the line here, but there's a few resources from the Privacy Trust and Advisory Center, ptac.gov, that really get into kind of what the details of this are. And then there's a group called COSN, COSN.org. And COSN has a 10 principles to data privacy. And these are, and they're now selling kind of a seal to be a voluntary official supporter. Most of them are sort of like thou shall not, and I agree, you won't do bad things. But ultimately it comes down to how you handle data breach and data security. So there are, And then on the consumer side, there's something called Privo, P-R-I-V-O. And what's also getting traction is Common Sense Media. Common Sense Media is a place where parents can go to check out game titles, movies, and now all of the online curriculum. Common Sense Media has an emerging service called Graphite, which is cataloging school-focused curriculum. So I think the free market is actually starting to gel around this. And so it gets back to that core conversation earlier. Are you for institutions or for individuals? On the consumer side, Privo and Common Sense Media make some sense. On the institution side, the COSIN seal with their trusted learning environment, they've got this new TLE seal. What the market adoption of that is sort of, I'm not sure. But the one that I am seeing that actually has real teeth to it, and I don't know across the country how broad this is, but within the state of Massachusetts, and they're trying to cooperate with COSIN on this, Cambridge Public Schools and Boston Public Schools, and once those two giants went, have created a standard term of service document regarding student data breach, student security. Because if you are going to ultimately sell to institutions, and if you do want institutions to either officially approve you, not block you from the routers, or ultimately even pay you, then they are going to force you to sign their agreement. And very few of us have the bandwidth to sign a new agreement with every new school district across the country, with all the variants that some local attorney might have. And those attorneys in Cambridge, Massachusetts are pretty darn smart. But yet, they might agree to something that a guy in, an hour from Austin, Texas thinks is a new law. So what they've done is band together to support a common contract and effectively bring consistency for the IT team with their civil legal team by saying, hey, it's good enough for Boston and Cambridge. Why are you in suburb ABC objecting to something that Cambridge and Boston said is okay? So now, at least as a partner, you can agree to a particular set of terms of service and then say, look, this is good enough for Boston and Cambridge. We signed it. This is now the benchmark for what we will agree to. And then bring that to every other district and say, why do you think you're different than a major urban district like Boston and Cambridge?
This is awesome stuff. I'm going to ask you at the end, and I'll ask Van as well, to email me kind of a link to some of these sites, and I'll post it on our Slack channel. A couple of observations here. The COSIN sign reminds me of back in the 90s when the Better Business Bureau had their BBB online seal.
Yep.
And then VeriSign had their seal that you'd put on your credit card processing page. And it's a way to telegraph to your customers, whether they're institutions or individuals, that they can be comfortable with your site. So those, if they have enough traction to mean anything, those start to become very interesting. And I like the idea that you mentioned earlier that if you're using a standard terms of service, number one, it's a good place for you to start from at the very least. And number two, it does give you that shield to say, hey, Harvard's good with this, right? MIT is good with this. Or the equivalent K-12 districts in the area, lay out exactly where your objections are for me so I understand. And sometimes they go away. Not always. There's always a lawyer looking to prove his worth by marking something up. But it does give you something to stand on.
Well, a place where that really worked, and I know a number of your a number of the cohort firms are focused on higher ed. Both Google and Microsoft were approached by a consortium of higher ed, the leading higher ed institutions, around the use of our cloud productivity services, notably Google Apps and Office 365, for what's called a HIPAA BAA, right? So related to health information and the business associate agreement that is the FERPA equivalent, but for universities, because there's medical center activity and they have on-site clinics, etc. You did have to agree to HIPAA BAA rights. And just like FERPA, those rules were all over the map. And in fact, HIPAA was actually more restrictive than FERPA. And both Google and Microsoft were having to sign different agreements with the likes of Duke, Stanford, Berkeley, all of whom had lawyers that thought very highly of themselves. So, to their credit, they banded together, one, to get terms that we wouldn't necessarily agree to individually, but at least so that they had the power of numbers. But then it created standardization. And so when, fill in the blank state began to object, our answer was, go call the following people at Duke, Northwestern, Berkeley, MIT, and you tell them why their agreement isn't good enough, because they told us they spoke for the industry. Mm-hmm. And that really worked well, and I think there's similar models out there.
Cool. Van, any other resources you'd like to add to the discussion?
I think in terms of trying to track what's going on in the states, the Future of Privacy Forum has a great site up called FERPA.org that does a good job of tracking what's going on in the states, and also giving some very succinct tips for vendors around both what to be looking at as well as for what to be thinking about in terms of data privacy. And then interestingly enough, I think that actually the FTC and the Department of Ed have done a good job, both of them, in putting up sites on their respected places dealing with what you need to be thinking about from a vendor or an institutional perspective for both COPA and FERPA. So those are the two that sort of immediately spring to mind for me.
Excellent, great. So while I'm going to open up the floor for questions in a moment. So teams, if you have any questions, just throw them in the chat box for now. While they're writing their questions, Van, Rob, what didn't we cover that you think we absolutely should say something about before we convene?
I would love to comment or hear from others what the current tone of the seed, angel, and venture community is around business models. Because I know a couple years ago, the appetite for we sell to schools was near none. But forming a business model and understanding where you're going to make money, and whether it falls within the boundaries of the constraints of FERPA, that's ultimately the biggest question you need to sort of architect for.
Yeah, so if you'd like to hear from the startups, what their experiences are talking to investors, I invite you to come back in July after the Investor Roadshow, and they'll have a couple of hundred data points for you. In my experience, one of the models that was really, really hot 2-3 years ago, or maybe 4 years ago, was the teacher freemium model, and you just don't see much appetite for that anymore because it's proven harder to pull off in practice than a lot of people thought it would be, with notable successes though. Van, anything else that you would like to throw on the table?
Yeah, I would add to keep an eye on what's going on in Congress right now with HR 3157, which of all of the student data privacy acts that were passed introduced last year and this year, seems to be the one where most of the conversation has gelled. Now, having said that, I don't know that there is a great likelihood of it being passed this session. But I do think that it indicates where the federal government is going to be going, and I think that if we can get federal legislation passed, that may take the pressure off of states to do this in a piecemeal fashion.
Got it. Great. So we had some questions before, so there may not be any more questions from the audience. I'm going to give them another moment or two to submit them. If we don't get anything in the next minute or two, I'll go into thank yous all around. Okay, no one's raising their hands. So that means Van, Rob, thank you very much for coming on. We really appreciate it. I will follow up with you. I have a list that I jotted down while we were talking to the resources. I will follow up with you to make sure I haven't missed anything.
All right.
Great, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks
Enjoyed it.
Really appreciate it. And that's Rob and his full-on witness protection shade.
Yes. I feel like I moved back over here somewhere. Who knows? I kind of work in the dark.
Yeah. Well, as long as we're not building businesses in the dark, I'm happy.
Right. There's very, very little light inside my head.
Fantastic.
Thanks, guys.
All right, have a
Thank
great
you, guys. I
day.
appreciate it.
Have a
Thank you
great
very much.
afternoon or morning, as the case may be.
Take care.